where we take a look at music, movies, books, and other media that's either out of print, out of reach, or has never been released. I'm Lana, and today we're taking a look at Anne Frank's diary, the graphic adaptation. On Monday, July the 6th of 1942 in Amsterdam, 13-year-old Hannah Goslar's mother sent her on an errand. Just a month earlier, the Nazis had prohibited Jews from using bicycles or any kind of public transit, and the Goslar family was Jewish. Hannah's mother was expecting, and making the trip on her own on foot might not have been feasible. So off Hannah went to help her mother get what she needed to make strawberry jam. Hannah was told to go to the home of the Frank family and ask if she could borrow a scale used for measuring out opekta, a gelatin used for making jam. Hannah's mother had a few old packets of the jam additive, and the Frank family was in the business of producing it. The Franks were good friends of the Goslars, so it wasn't at all uncommon for one family to borrow something from the other. But when Hannah arrived at the Franks' home and rang the bell, no one answered. She rang again and again. And just as she was probably starting to suspect that no one was home, the door swung open. And there stood a very frustrated man in glasses standing in the doorway. The man was a Dutch lodger in the Frank home named Goldschmidt, and although he knew Hannah, he looked at her as though she were a stranger. "What do you want?" he demanded. "I'm here to borrow a scale from Mrs. Frank," Hannah said. "And, is Anne home? I wanted to see if she could play." Hannah was caught off guard by Goldschmidt. She had never known anyone to open the door to the Franks' home other than the Franks themselves. Goldschmidt told Hannah that the Frank family was gone. They had moved to Switzerland. Hannah was surprised that Anne hadn't told her that they were leaving. The Frank family were community staples. Their daughter Anne was Hannah's age, and the two girls were friends who attended the same school. Anne and Hannah had had their disagreements before, but surely that wasn't the reason why Anne would just disappear without saying a word. How could Anne just leave without saying anything at all? Though I'm sure as soon as Hannah asked, some part of her already knew the reason. Jews in Amsterdam had already been sequestered into strictly patrolled districts of the city. Park benches bared signs saying Jews and dogs not wanted, and in July of that year, the Nazis had started deporting Jews from Amsterdam. By January of 1943, around 43,000 Jews had been deported from the city. Because Switzerland was neutral during the war, many Jews fled to safety there, but thousands were turned away. The Goslar family had already fled from Germany to escape Nazi occupation, so at 13 years old, Hannah Goslar already knew what it meant to flee for your life, and she hoped that Anne and her family would find safety in Switzerland. Hannah imagined Anne reuniting with her grandmother in Switzerland, and going for walks in meadows under the shadow of the Alps. Maybe the two of them would sit in a warm kitchen that winter, snowflakes falling outside, while they sipped big mugs of hot chocolate together. Now, if you were wondering, I don't know if Hannah's mother ever got to make that strawberry jam, because Hannah's mother died in childbirth just 4 months later. The baby, sadly, did not survive. On June 20th of 1943, at 5 a.m., while everyone was asleep, the Nazis closed in on the Goslar family's street. Okay, I know. That ominous music tells us everything we need to know, so let's just stop for a moment there. But come on, from the moment I said Nazis, you knew this story wasn't going to go anywhere good. I mean, Nazis are going to Nazi, you know? And I realize that sitting through all of this heavy stuff can be emotionally taxing. So let's lose the danger music and go with some tunes that are a little less stressful, shall we? Okay, that's clearly worse. Let's lose the music altogether. I know. How about we just gamify the situation? I'll give you the too long, didn't read abbreviated version of the story, and every time you hear something heartbreakingly tragic and nightmare-inducing, you can just assign a score to it on a sheet of paper, and we can tally our points at the end. How about 500 points for each event that you find disturbing? Does that sound fair? Uh, I guess I probably should have told you ahead of time to have paper ready. Go ahead and grab a sheet of paper. I'll wait. Do, 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 do. You got your sheet of paper? You good? Okay. I apologize ahead of time to anyone who's exercising or driving while listening to this. But who am I kidding? No one is listening to this anyway. So let's get back to our story. Everybody got your pencil and paper ready? Okay, here we go. On June 20th of 1943, Nazis closed in on the Goslar family street. Points for that. They knocked on doors and started making arrests. Now, up until now, the Goslar family had avoided arrest by using Palestinian papers and Paraguayan passports that Hannah's father had purchased to ensure their safety. They were eligible to be exchanged for German prisoners of war held by the British, so the hope was that as long as they had these papers, they wouldn't be sent to the camps. But this time, their papers were of no use. A Christian neighbor of theirs approached the SS and asked if she could take custody of Hannah's younger sister Gabby, who was only 2 years old at the time. When the SS officer asked the neighbor if she was ashamed to be offering help to a Jew, the woman fainted, probably overcome with fear of what would happen to her for having even made the request. That's definitely nightmare fuel, so let's put down a few extra points for that. Hannah was given only 20 minutes to gather up her belongings before she, her maternal grandparents, and her little sister Gabby were transported to Westerbork transit camp in German-occupied Netherlands, where Hannah's grandmother died from a heart attack. From Westerbork, the family was taken to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in Germany. The winter there was freezing cold, but thankfully Hannah had brought winter clothes along with her. So, I mean, it's good that she thought to do that, but, she's still in a concentration camp. So I'm going to go ahead and say we should put down some marks for that as well. The camp became increasingly crowded with starving prisoners. The most unfortunate were sent to tent camp, a makeshift addition to Bergen-Belsen that had been thrown together to deal with overcrowding. Most prisoners there got a cup of soup per day and a piece of bread that was meant to last 8 days, which they had to break off into tiny morsels. Prisoners slept with their bread so that it wouldn't be taken by desperate thieves in the night. And after 1944, there seemed to be a constant influx of new detainees. And in early January or maybe February of 1945, one such group they knew of was Dutch. And as we know, Anne Frank spoke Dutch. So hey, this moment is somewhat hopeful, but this, again, is in a concentration camp, so let's go ahead and make our marks accordingly. Anyway, some of the prisoners in Sternlager camp, where Hannah was held, let her know that Anne Frank was just across the fence in tent camp, where, due to overcrowding and poor sanitation, the sickest prisoners usually were. That's heartbreaking, so if you were second-guessing that last mark you made on your paper, this should make you feel a little bit better. I mean, as better as you can feel while you're listening to a horrific Holocaust story, right? Anyway, the fence separating tent camp from Sternlager camp was stuffed with straw so that the prisoners on either side couldn't see one another, and approaching the fence was risky. German guards with machine guns were on patrol, with German shepherds whose sense of smell could overcome anyone's efforts to hide. And that's bad news, so... But Hannah was determined to see her friend, so before the 9 p.m. curfew, Hannah tucked in her little sister Gabby and crept out quietly to the fence and softly called out into the darkness. And a woman's voice answered. It was Augusta Van Pels, who we know is one of those who hid with Anne in the secret annex in the Netherlands. The Frank story of fleeing to Switzerland had been a cover-up, so that no one would come searching for them while they were in hiding. Now, just to check in with you, none of this is overwhelmingly bad news compared to what we've gotten so far, so I hope that pencil of yours is perfectly still. Anyway, Mrs. Van Pels knew Hannah as a mutual friend of the Frank family and immediately said, "You must want to speak to Anne. I'll bring her. Margot is here too, but she's too sick to come." Anne's sister Margot had typhus and could no longer walk the distance to the fence. Hannah had never expected to meet her friend Anne again during the war, and she definitely hadn't thought she would meet her here of all places. So again, there's a glimmer of hope here. See, this story may not be all bad. As Hannah listened to Mrs. Van Pels' footsteps grow more distant, her heart pounded. The risk she took in seeing her friend could cost her her life if she was caught. But within a few minutes, Hannah heard a familiar whisper from the other side of the fence. "Hannah Lee," a voice called out. Hannah Lee was the nickname that the unmistakable voice had given her so long ago. This was the voice of Anne Frank. The two girls broke into tears. The happy kind. This doesn't warrant any mark on your paper, okay? Now, Anne's head had been shaved, likely to stop the spread of lice, and she was starving. Anne told Hannah about the secret annex and why she had vanished without a word. And Hannah told Anne about the death of her mother, Ruth Clee, in 1942, and the death of her grandfather in Westerbrook. But she assured Anne she still had her grandmother and her little sister Gabby there with her. Anne lamented that she had no one. She was alone there with her very sick sister Margot. Anne's mother had died the previous month of starvation in Auschwitz, though Anne probably didn't know this at the time. Anne's father Otto had also been sent to Auschwitz in September of the previous year, in 1944. And Anne told Hannah about the gas that awaited them all there. So that's a big one. So how about just whatever your score is on your paper right now, we go ahead and double it. Does that feel respectful enough? I mean, as respectful as you can feel while you're keeping score during a Holocaust story, which, by the way, is a really insensitive thing to do. You should probably feel terrible about yourself. And that's definitely worth an additional mark, so... Anyway, Anne told Hannah that she was starving and asked for food. Hannah agreed to help, and after whispering her goodbyes, she rushed back to the barracks where the women there made what donations they could to Hannah's charity. People donated some scraps of bread and cracker crumbs. Some even gave what stray socks and gloves they could spare. The donations were generous considering that they were down to 1 bowl of thin soup per day, along with 1.5 inches of bread every other day. Hannah stuffed it all into a sock, and the next night she met Anne at the fence again. Hannah was able to throw the care package over the fence, but a hungry thief intercepted it on the other side. Now that was really heartbreaking, so let's add a few additional points to this one, shall we? Hannah would make one more attempt the next night. Now, Hannah wasn't an athletic girl at all, and she was weak from hunger, but despite that, she threw the second package and it was able to clear the barbed wire at the top of the fence. And, thankfully, Anne caught it. Now, hey, that was pretty good, right? I bet you didn't expect anything good to happen in this story, did you? Well, except those of you who read Hannah Gosler's book or watched one of the Anne Frank movies that dramatizes this scene. But hey, whether it's news to you or not, this moment never stops being good. Anyway, Hannah's father died in the hospital barracks soon afterward. And she wanted to tell Anne what had happened, but when she returned to the fence a few days later, no one was to be found. And it wasn't possible to see through the thick straw that obstructed her view. Hannah's grandmother passed away shortly afterward. Because of the family's Palestinian papers, Hannah's grandmother would have been eligible for a prisoner of war exchange, but instead she had chosen to stay in Bergen-Belsen to look after her granddaughters. And it had cost her her life. Hannah would visit the fence a few days later in hopes of telling Anne everything that had happened. But Anne was nowhere to be found. Somewhere around this time, Margot Frank passed away. The woman that the Nazis had put in charge of Anne's barracks was a prisoner named Irma Minkel. When Anne came down with typhus, Irma told her that she didn't have to go to roll call and that she could stay in and rest. Anne told Irma that she was getting sicker, to which Irma replied, "You're not sick," in hopes of giving the young girl some reassurance. Anne eventually slipped into a coma and died in Irma's arms. As many had there in tent camp. Hannah Gosler and her sister Gabby survived the war. The only surviving member of the Frank family was Anne's father, Otto. Because the Frank family had stayed relatively healthy while in hiding, he was able to avoid the gas since he didn't have the emaciated appearance of his peers while he was in Auschwitz. All those under 15 or over 55 went to the gas chamber, and even though Otto was 55 when he arrived, he wasn't selected by the Nazis for the gas. When the Russians liberated Auschwitz, Otto weighed 115 pounds. A fellow Auschwitz survivor named Rosa de Winter would tell Otto of his wife's passing. Otto then returned to the home of Jan and Miep Gies, who had helped the Franks hide during the war. In July of 1945, the Brillisippa sisters, who had survived Bergen-Belsen, told Otto about Anne and Margot. When Otto told Jan and Miep of his daughter's passing, Miep presented him with Anne's diary. After the Frank family had been arrested, she had found its papers scattered across the floor of the annex, and she had collected them and saved them, hoping that she might get a chance to return them to Anne after the war. So, thanks to Miep and Jan, a part of Anne had survived. Okay. All right, so put your pencils down. Go ahead and tally your points. And once you've got your number, go and tell someone near you how well you did in a fun, interactive Holocaust game that you heard online. They'll think you have some kind of terrible personality disorder. And maybe that'll get you out of some kind of obligatory social event that you really didn't want to attend in the first place. So, hey, now you don't have to go to that bachelorette party for your boss, or help your cousin pack boxes and move across town. You're welcome. But I digress. Back to Anne Frank's diary. As you know, it survived the war. But the work of many writers during the war wasn't so lucky. As part of their cultural genocide, the Nazis destroyed millions of books and manuscripts by scientists, theologians, and anyone whose work was deemed to be impure by Nazi standards. In Poland alone, it's been estimated that they destroyed up to 80% of all school libraries and 3/4 of all scientific libraries in the country. On May the 6th of 1933, the Berlin chapter of the German Student Union burned the library and records of the Institute of Sex Research in Germany, which offered marriage counseling, gynecological examinations, treatment for alcoholism, and it also campaigned for LGBT rights. It's been estimated that some 50,000 Germans that could be identified as LGBT were sent to prisons, where many are said to have been the subject of bizarre medical experiments, mutilations, and torture. And libraries were far from the only target in the cultural genocide. Germans controlled journalism in all of their occupied territories and suppressed news outlets in favor of promoting their narrative. They suppressed writings by Jews, Muslims, Catholics, LGBT writers, and on the list went, until finding any information counter to their bizarre Christian nationalist extremist view of the world became hauntingly scarce. Anne Frank wrote of the war, terrible things are happening outside. Poor helpless people are being dragged out of their homes. Families are torn apart. Now look, I know that someone likely has their finger hovering over the stop button right now, just waiting to prevent me from stepping on that cliche landmine that everyone loves to walk all over at every possible opportunity. Too many people love to tell a cautionary tale about the Holocaust, just so they can bring up current events and paint themselves as deep, insightful storytellers who really have their fingers on the pulse of the human condition. You've heard all that before. History repeats itself. It'll happen again if we're not careful. Just listen to the needlessly sad violin music swelling in the background. The children. Think of the children. And hey, I get that. But I find myself in an uncomfortable position here. This podcast is about the graphic novel version of Anne Frank's diary. And while some school libraries have pulled it, and the only way for me to do that is to take a look at the political climate that's encouraged those kinds of restrictions. Now, I'm not going to stand on some soapbox and say that somehow human rights violations in the United States are as bad as Nazi Germany. But hey, whether you like it or not, we are, without a doubt, beginning to circle that drain. More than ever this year, I've felt like the news affecting everyday Americans just isn't making it to the top of the news feed at major news outlets much anymore. But Trump's lawsuits against the New York Times, Paramount, the Wall Street Journal, his defunding of the Public Broadcast Corporation, and his threats against CBS may be partially to blame. Even Wikipedia has recently announced that it intends to sanitize its content in favor of being more sensitive to conservative values. And as a result of all this insanity, One of our primary news sources seems to have become everyday Americans recording the chaos on their cell phones. Every time I see a cell phone recorded video of ICE agents wrestling unarmed people to the ground and zip tying them, I wonder why this isn't being covered absolutely everywhere. But such are the times we live in. ICE raids, along with National Guard deployments to majority Democratic cities, continue to be one of the Trump administration's primary goals. And on a personal note, watching what they've done to Chicago recently has been nothing short of disturbing.
And the people of Chicago are walking around with MAGA hats. You have women, beautiful black women, walking around with MAGA hats. Please let the president in, and we don't care how he does it. They're not interested in National Guard or Army, Navy, bring them in. Marines, bring in the Marines. They just want the crime to stop.
And despite all evidence to the contrary, the White House maintains that a militant occupation is what the American people really want.
They was terrified. The kids was crying. People was screaming. They looked very distraught. I was out there crying when I seen the little girl come around the corner. Because they was bringing the kids out too. Had them zip tied to each other. That's all I kept asking. Where's the morality? Where's the human? One of them literally laughed. He was standing right here. He said, them kids.
And just in case you were wondering, that lady most definitely was not wearing a red hat. And I seriously doubt she asked for any authorities to come terrorize her neighborhood or kidnap her neighbors. Now, of course, I realize that most politicians have seldom, if ever, been trustworthy sources of much of anything, and that there's always news that doesn't get the coverage it deserves. But it's not just the news that's under siege in America. In addition to ICE raids across the country, book banning is beginning to become normalized in America. According to PEN America, there have been 6,870 instances of book bans across 23 states during the 2024-2025 school year. And the books that have been under fire are the usual suspects. You know, most everything with any kind of suspected LGBT content has been pulled from school libraries in conservative areas. Because, you know, if your kid brings home a book in which somebody is L, G, B, or even T, then obviously your child will turn gay. And then you'll turn gay. Your family will turn gay. And rainbows will surely explode out of the roof of your home to warn everyone within a 500-mile radius to stay as far away from you as is possible, and ostracize you at every opportunity they have. And you might just not be ready to be gay. I mean, it sounds like a big commitment. What do you even wear? Do you have to learn how to dance? I've heard that's a thing. But in all seriousness, LGBT-adjacent books aren't the only ones getting pulled. Far from it. Books that describe any experience that's unique to any ethnic background are beginning to become accused of promoting critical race theory. And what's stranger still, books about the Holocaust are being pulled from libraries. Yes, the Holocaust. Memorializing the Holocaust by Janet Jacobs was removed from the U.S. Naval Academy's Nimitz Library in April of this year over DEI concerns. The Devil's Arithmetic by Jane Yolen has been pulled from Leander School District in Texas over concerns of DEI content as well. The graphic novel White Bird by R.J. Palacio has been pulled from some school districts. And it's not the only graphic novel to have been pulled either. I bet you can't guess which one I'm going to bring up next. Well, it just so happens that the graphic novelization of Anne Frank's diary has also been banned in several U.S. school districts. Now, if you were wondering when I was going to get around to finally talking about this book, I apologize for the very long preamble. And I realize that even if you've never read the Diary of Anne Frank, you likely already know the basic story. Aside from Hitler himself, Anne Frank is probably the most recognized historical figure of World War II. You know the story. From 1942 to 1944, Anne Frank hid from the Nazis with her family and their companions. And sadly, they were eventually discovered in August of 1944. It's a very well-documented story. In addition to there being two versions of Anne's diary that she penned herself, there's also the version that her father released to the world. There's the stage plays, the live-action films, a couple of animated movies, the virtual museum tours, and most recently, the graphic novel adapted by Ari Holman and artist David Polanski. Now, in an era in which we're constantly inundated with images from every screen we surround ourselves with, the omission of this version hits really hard. Let's face it, more than ever, we've become very visual creatures. And for young readers who are still honing their skills, A lot of teachers assert that graphic novels are a huge gateway into literacy. But not everyone agrees with that sentiment. In 2023, a school teacher in Texas was fired for showing the Diary of Anne Frank graphic novel to a middle school class. And the book has been targeted by Moms for Liberty, an extremist political organization that advocates against any mention of LGBTQ rights, race, ethnicity, or any kind of critical race theory in public schools. And they even supported a Texas state law that mandates the display of the Ten Commandments in public school classrooms. Look, at the risk of stating the obvious, it's great to be part of a group, and it's great to care about the people who are in that group with you. But Christian nationalism is nothing the world hasn't seen before. Nazi Germany was an overwhelmingly Christian state, famous for genocide, widespread persecution, and book burning. So it goes without saying that, in this day and age, pursuing a Christian nationalist agenda while taking away books is, as the kids say, a bad look. But make no mistake, that's exactly the way things are trending, and the Anne Frank graphic novel looks to be rather high on their hit list of things to erase. So what is it about this graphic novel, of all things, that's gotten them so excited? And why don't they want their kids to learn about a famous family of Jews, whose beliefs are the very foundation of the Christian faith? The short answer is that most of us who read Anne Frank's diary when we were in school likely read an abridged version. And if you've never read an unabridged version, the intimate details that Anne included in the pages of her diary, or Kitty as she called it, might surprise you. So, as I mentioned before, there are at least 3 core versions of Anne Frank's diary. The first was Anne's original unedited version. The second is a revised edition that Anne intended for the eyes of the public, which is pretty profound for someone as young as she was. Anne got the idea to rewrite her diary into a new version after hearing a Radio Oranje broadcast on March 8th of 1944 from Mariet Bokelstein. Bokelstein was a minister of the Dutch government in exile, and he said that after the war, the government had plans to collect diaries and other documents to preserve them for a kind of national archive. Now, the version of Anne's diary that's probably known best is the one put together by her father, Otto Frank. And this edition is an amalgamation of Anne's 2 versions, with the notable omission of some things that Otto chose to hold back, probably in hopes of giving his family's legacy the best foot forward that it could possibly have. It was the late 1940s, and times were different. The omissions he made, most notably about Anne's relationship with her mother, may have been in the interest of protecting the memory of his deceased wife. But however incomplete this version was, the world was intrigued. The book was first produced in its original Dutch in 1947, with translations into German and French to follow afterward. It was the French version that captivated writer and editor Judith Jones, who rescued the diary of Anne Frank from a pile of reject books at Doubleday Printing in New York, who, with Jones's recommendation, published the diary in English. A new annotated edition was released in Dutch in 1986, with an English version to follow in 1989. And then, of course, there's the definitive edition that was released in English in 1995, and I probably missed an edition. Maybe I missed several. There have been so many that it's a little tough to keep track without a flowchart, and those probably exist too. It's a very beloved and well-documented story. So with all of these editions, why is a graphic novel even necessary? And the short answer is that it's an introduction to the story. For young people, this story can sometimes be just one more book that a school has piled on top of your required reading list. And most editions are well over 350 pages, which can feel intimidating if it's just one of many important books you have to tackle in a semester. And that's especially true for emerging readers. The graphic novel edition isn't at all a replacement for the diary, and it was never intended to be. It's a very condensed retelling that takes a show and don't tell approach whenever it can, and that might lead some to mistake this for another abridged version. But that would be a mistake. The usual suspects that are typically found missing in previously abridged versions of the diary are all present here. Namely, Anne's strained relationship with her mother, Anne's experiences with puberty, and her thoughts on sexuality, including her interest in the female form. Now, hey, don't do that. We haven't even talked about the specifics yet here. Come on, give it a rest. What was I saying? Oh yeah, all too often, Anne Frank is used as a kind of strange mascot for history. There are schools and statues and so much more made in her honor. But obviously, she was a real person with her own hopes, dreams, aspirations, and frustrations. And that's part of what makes her so appealing. And although anyone would be quick to agree with that sentiment, it doesn't change the fact that figureheads often carry the weight of the expectations we project onto them. But Anne Frank obviously didn't live to see her life turned into museum visits and store shelves full of paperback diary translations for sale. She was a kid who loved films, story writing, romance, and Hollywood actors. And however anyone else might object to the graphic novelization of her diary, I can't help but wonder if she wouldn't have just absolutely loved it, because it's an amazing spectacle. It exists as a companion piece to the 2020 animated feature Where is Anne Frank?, which is the story of Kitty, the personified figure of Anne Frank's diary herself, who emerges from the annex to look for Anne. The character finds that the world has changed a lot since Anne was around, and that the world has plastered Anne's image across books and buildings, and not always with the best of intentions. And Kitty finds that, although the war is over, persecution still exists in the modern world. Kitty is somewhat of a specter inside the Anne Frank house, and can even pass unseen through patrons like a ghost. But when the diary is carried outside, Kitty becomes visible to the world outside. She even starts a romance with a pickpocket named Peter, who was probably named in homage to Peter Van Pels, who, Anne had kind of a thing with. Now, Jewish people were barred from movie theaters under Nazi occupation, and Anne Frank adored movies. Theater magazines were among her prized possessions in the annex. I can't help but think that Anne herself would really have loved to have seen this film. And all the films about her, honestly. The animation in Where is Anne Frank is great. And while the concept of the film is definitely an interesting one, a lot of people criticize the film's heavy-handed message about history potentially repeating itself. The film was directed by Ari Folman, the progeny of Holocaust survivors himself, who's probably best known for the HBO series In Treatment and the animated film Waltz with Bashir about the 1982 Lebanon War. The unique visual style found in both Where is Anne Frank and Waltz with Bashir can be largely credited to the work of illustrator David Polanski. And Polanski and Folman both produced the graphic novelization of Anne Frank's diary as well. But despite the fact that their Anne Frank animated film and their graphic novel both stand in tribute to Anne Frank, the two works shouldn't be mistaken for the same thing. The film is very much about why Anne Frank's experience is so important to the modern world. But the graphic novelization is just that, their illustrated version of the diary. And the story is all here. As I said before, it's a highly condensed version, so it's a much different approach to storytelling. But none of the essential parts of the story are absent. In fact, they seem more vivid to me now than maybe they ever have. And it kicks off very much the way you expect it to. On July 5th of 1942, Anne's sister Margot is summoned to work by the Nazis. She's ordered to report to a labor camp in Germany, an experience from which the Franks know she likely won't return. So the Frank family, along with their friends the Van Pels and the dentist Fritz Pfeffer, go into hiding together. The Frank family takes very few of their belongings, and they leave their home disheveled and their beds unmade, so that it'll look like they left in a hurry. They even leave behind their pet cat. You know the story. And when you pick up this book, you'll expect to find simple illustrations that show the austerity of their lives in the annex. But the entire book is a very imaginative work of art, and if simple illustrations are what you expect to find, you may be surprised at what you see. The first time I read through this book, I was too impressed with the images to notice that certain threads of the story are broken into these very clever recurring motifs that make you feel like there's worlds within worlds that are always growing beneath the surface in the annex. And every time I read through this book, I feel like I notice more and more of these interwoven threads. The most memorable motif for me are the reoccurring images of being submerged. Submerged in darkness, submerged in emotions, and submerged in water. Polanski is especially clever in using this motif to characterize Anne's short-lived romance with Peter Van Pels. And making this connection with Peter is somewhat of a dark process for Anne. On page 125, we see Anne beside herself, literally. One Anne rests her head on Peter's shoulder while reaching out her hand to cover the mouth of a second Anne, who looks on with concern. She has obvious reservations about her secret crush on Peter and worries that she might have too much influence on him. In one image, Anne is seen as a teacher in a classroom, showing Peter a projected image of black and white spirals that seem to hypnotize him. We see this classroom again later, filled with water, and Peter clings to Anne as she sinks down to the bottom. On another page, Peter's drawn as a giant jellyfish, able to carry Anne through the serenity of his world, and also able to shock her if she's not careful with him. We even see the two of them happily encased in a snow globe, safe from the scrutiny of their families outside. When we see Peter alone, he's wallowing in his hypochondria. Isolated in his room, he's submerged in darkness. But when he's with Anne, he's in an emotional space that's completely separate from the annex. But Anne, of course, has to question her impulse to be in that space with him, and whether or not it's good for either of them. But Peter's room is the only space in the annex where Anne seems to be free from her seemingly one-sided sibling rivalry with her sister Margot. Which is part of the next motif we should get into: foils. Like most anyone with an older sibling, Anne feels like she's constantly being compared unfavorably to her sister. In one beautiful page, we see Anne being a picky eater, alongside Margot finishing a meal. Anne storming out of a room while Margot is praised by everyone. Anne struggling to fold clothes while Margot puts the finishing touches on a neatly folded stack. Anne struggling to write as Margot seems to study effortlessly. It conveys so much of what Anne's feeling, and with so few words. Margot is even represented in a series of idyllic Greek busts to show us the virtues of her seemingly perfect character. We also see this theme of foils in Anne's bedroom. Anne sleeps peacefully, but she's woken up early every day by her roommate, the dentist Dr. Pfeffer. And yeah, I know that dentists in the Netherlands were considered doctors in the 1940s, but Dr. Pfeffer is just fun to say. Anyway, the dentist starts out his morning with calisthenics in the tiny claustrophobic room, and he stretches out his leg high over Anne's bed, invading her space before she's even had a chance to wake up. Even though Anne keeps the room more or less in order, she finds a pair of Dr. Pfeffer's boxers laid out over her diary on top of the desk. The frustration is palpable, to say the least. She fantasizes about threatening to burn his boxers over an open fire unless he agrees to be more mindful of her space. He even refers to her as Your Highness in hopes of saving his underwear. Now, I don't know about you, but I've never fantasized about burning anyone's underwear before. But now we have this book to thank for the suggestion. Fantasies like this are the subject of our next motif: frustrations brought to life. Maybe a middle school English student would more succinctly use the word personification, but that's not the right word in all cases. If you take a quick look at just a few pages, you'll see what I mean. We see Augusta Van Pell's rabbit stole come to life around her neck and protest her husband's insistence on her selling the garment. We see Anne imagine her family and housemates pictured as wind-up mechanical toys, endlessly repeating themselves as they vent about the monotony of their confines. The two matriarchs of the annex, Augusta Van Pell's and Anne's mother, are drawn as fire-breathing dragons, as Anne expresses her frustration with them both. And Polanski is particularly impressive with this motif when he uses it to recreate masterpiece paintings with Anne as the subject matter. Polanski paints Anne as Edvard Munch's The Scream to show the overwhelming cacophony of everyone's complaints collectively weighing in on her. Why can't you be more like your sister Margot, they say. When Anne wishes that she could completely suppress her frustrations and project an ideal, tranquil face to the world, Polanski illustrates this by painting Anne as Gustav Klimt's portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer, the image of the woman in gold. A painting that was famously raided from the sugar industrialist's home when the Nazis took Austria in 1938. But obviously, it miraculously survived the war. And surviving the war, or at least fantasizing about it, is also one of the motifs in this book. Some residents of the annex dream of simpler things like hot baths and endless tea. Anne, we see, dreams of life as a journalist, and a socialite from whom others hope to find approval. We see Anne imagine herself as different famous actresses like Bette Davis and Ingrid Bergman. And although Anne seems to self-aggrandize a little, her fantasies of the future line up pretty well with her depiction of her life before she came to the annex. When Anne is talking about the past, we see her fantasies of being pursued and admired by the most eligible young men in her school. In one fantasy, a boy complains about her bringing all of her friends along on a date, to which she replies that it's not all of her friends, just 20 of her best ones. This book opens with an image of Anne's birthday party and what looks like a pretty enticing cake with pink frosting. But that image is the first and last picture of appealing food that you'll see as you make your way through this story. Which brings us to our next motif, glop. And no, I'm not really good at Scrabble. I just Googled words that meant unappetizing food, and that's what I got. So I'm going to pretend that I thought of that by myself. Kind of like people who write prompts that AI uses to generate garbage that people call art. And somehow those people naively believe that they had a hand in its creation somehow. But I digress. As the Frank family's diet gets more and more meager and repetitive, we see hilarious images inspired by Anne's imagination. When everyone is fed up with beans, we see the people of the world covering their noses as a brown, putrid stench lifts into the air. There's an Inuit, a geisha, a sub-Saharan tribesman, a Sikh, a Swedish man in traditional garb, a cowboy, and all kinds of people represented in this dense image of people lamenting their sense of smell. And in good times and in bad, we can see an Opecta poster hanging on the wall behind everyone. Opecta, as you probably know, was a jam additive that was housed in the facility beneath the secret annex. The poster is an amazing pop art image of a woman in a kitchen holding an open jar of jam upside down to show how thick it is. And a house cat seated below bats at it curiously. This poster, I feel sure, is the work of David Polanski, and it probably never existed. But I really want one of those posters anyway. Actually, I wouldn't mind having a few of them. Anyway, when meatloaf is made in the secret annex, we see all the ways that Anne is made to eat it. There's dried meatloaf, meatloaf tartare, meatloaf pancakes, and there's even a comical image of meatloaf that's used to make an artistic representation of Hitler's face. And on a side note, Hitler's depictions are very comical in this book. When the attempt to assassinate Hitler in July of 1944 fails, we see Hitler comically flying away from the explosion that was once his conference room. And afterward, a bandaged and enraged Hitler in the hospital, clenching his hands into fists. And it's of course a cruel irony that the murderer-in-chief himself was able to evade death for as long as he did while so many others couldn't. As food becomes more and more scarce, we see the fourth rider of the apocalypse, Death himself, looming over the family at the dinner table. It's an image that tells you everything you need to know, and everything that you don't want to know as well. During a British airstrike, the family is pictured at the table with Amsterdam burning behind them in the distance. Like most any story that takes place during a war, the shadow of death is an unavoidable motif here. Sometimes played for comedy, like the aforementioned scene of Hitler in the hospital, but other times death is portrayed as a stark presence looming over the annex. For example, in one fantasy, we see the family gathered before a firing squad, Dr. Pfeffer holding the hands of the girlfriend he misses so much as they stand in front of a heart-shaped spotlight, with Nazi rifles pointed straight at them. We see the comic examples of Augusta Van Pell's melodramatic outcries for attention crescendo into insincere threats of suicide. I should have said this already, but you'll of course remember her from the story/game we participated in earlier. You know, the fun one with the irritating scratchy pencil sounds that you'll soon be in therapy for. Anyway, Mrs. Van Pels was in the camp opposite of Hannah Gosler at Bergen-Belsen. And speaking of Hannah, she gets her own page in this version of the diary. Anne had a tremendous amount of guilt over leaving without telling her friend Hannah, and even more guilt over leaving her behind. We see Anne imagine her as a ghost who comes in the night, asking Anne why she's deserted her. We also see Hannah as a sad face that stares back at Anne in the mirror, lost in a sea of ghosts who are crowded together in the darkness behind the glass. We read Anne's thoughts on feminism above an image of a row of women in labor whose infant children are portrayed as developing into soldiers before our eyes. And we see Cro-Magnon man with a club alongside a soldier with a bayoneted rifle to show the lack of progress in humanity's endeavors. Now, I know what you're thinking. This all sounds really bleak. No wonder some people have reservations about this book. But that's not all this book has. It's filled with humor and amazing images that will seriously make you laugh. We see Anne's story ideas brought to life in this book, like Katie's life. The story of a woman who's released from a sanitarium only to find that her lover has become a Nazi. She, of course, leaves him because of her concern for the Jewish plight, and she marries a well-to-do widower, but she secretly misses the man she loved before he became a Nazi anyway. We even see an account of Anne's frustrations brought to life in an illustrated, albeit scathingly childish biography of Augusta Van Pels, where we see the woman as an infant in a stroller, demanding candy, and later she's shown as an adult who is rolling around in things you'd find on the ground in a farm. Now, in all fairness, I know it's a lot to expect someone to listen to you while you describe pictures and why you think they're important, so I'll leave it there. We do, however, need to address the elephant in the room. We need to talk about what exactly was in this story that upset extremists so much. You've probably heard about the 2 pages in Anne's diary that had brown paper glued over them. They remained as private as she left them until 2016. Now, whether or not the content should have been revealed to the world is the subject of some debate, but what was found underneath was nothing monumental, especially for someone of Anne's age. It might have been salacious for the time, but it hardly seems that way now. Now, if you're the type who would rather respect her privacy, I get that, so don't worry, I won't be telling you any of it here. And if you're the type who just has to know, I get that too. And rest assured that the information isn't at all hard to find online. Now, if someone in your home asks what you're frantically searching for on the internet, just blame it all on me. Now, of course, there are those who wish those pages had stayed concealed, if only to keep future volumes of the diary appropriate for young readers. But I'm not aware of anything directly from those 2 brown pages that's made it into the graphic novel. But what did make it in was a story about Anne's friend, Jacqueline Van Marsen, with whom Anne had a sleepover before she went into hiding. And Anne, being very young and curious, asked if she could see under Jacqueline's shirt. And this is where extremists seem to immediately recoil from the book. Does that make Anne a lesbian? Was Anne just curious about how her body had developed in relation to her friends? The obvious answer to these burning questions, of course, is who cares? Would it be interesting to know? Probably. Her writing is a cultural staple. There are those of us who would be interested in knowing what kind of toothpaste she liked. But those kind of details just aren't essential to this story. Anne may have known exactly who she was in all respects, and she may have still been discovering things about herself. But whoever she loved or didn't, Anne Frank is no more or less the writer you loved when you first picked up the book. But there are those who worry about the sleepover scene, and one more image that raises a few eyebrows. We see Anne dreaming of being outdoors, surrounded by Renaissance-style statues of female nudes, where Anne proclaims that the female form leaves her in ecstasy. Now, there are some who will see this and say, hey, case closed. But Anne Frank was an artist, and there's a reason this image shows her surrounded by works of art, because that's clearly how she sees them. If they were something more to her, then hey, that's cool. If nothing else, it makes for an interesting topic of conversation. But on the subject of conversation, we're not done with the list of infractions this book has when it comes to alarmists. The graphic novel also includes Anne's explanations of female physiology, and, as I mentioned before, her entrance into puberty, something that's portrayed as an event that brings her a lot of happiness. There are those who would argue that they don't want their kids learning about these subjects from a characterization of a historical figure in a graphic novel. But this is not a book that advocates for anyone to be anything. It's a diary. It's filled with intimate details, and expecting anything else from a diary might be misguided. This is a book that's still for sale at bookstores across North America, so it would be disingenuous to call it a banned book. But if you're a kid without transportation or pocket money of your own, your school library is still the only way to experience some stories, even in the 21st century. And if you're one of those kids in an extremely restrictive school, the graphic novelization of Anne Frank's diary is definitely missing media. For those who have smartphones, they can catch a few pages on an image search, but that's just not the same. And as you know, even though most kids have smartphones these days, not everybody does. Now, I don't have any kinds of heavy-handed remarks about the problems associated with restricted books about the Holocaust or why they shouldn't be scrutinized. You've heard all that before. But before we turn the last page on our story, bad pun intended, I wanted to talk about the end of Anne's story, and everyone's story from the annex, and who might have been responsible for their arrest on August the 4th of 1944. When Auschwitz was liberated in January of 1945, it would be another 6 weeks before Otto Frank had enough strength to make the journey home. He was the only survivor of the secret annex, the last man standing. The young Peter Van Pels, who for a time seemed like the object of Anne's brief infatuation, is said to have worked in the same group as Otto Frank in Auschwitz, and Otto looked after the boy. Peter's father Herman had been sent to the gas chamber in October of that year, and Peter had resolved that getting out of Auschwitz meant a better hope of survival. In January of 1945, when the great death marches from Auschwitz to Mauthausen in Austria began, Otto urged Peter to stay behind with him in Auschwitz and try to hide. But Peter thought his chances of survival were higher if he left. Peter was one of approximately 60,000 people who made the famous death march from Auschwitz to Mauthausen that stretched over 300 miles. And Peter is said to have made it to Mauthausen on January 25th of 1945. But on April the 11th, he was sent to the sick barracks. According to the Red Cross, he died on May the 10th of 1945, 5 days after Mauthausen was liberated by men from the 11th Armored Division of the United States. Remember Augusta Van Pels, Peter's mother? The melodramatic lady from the annex that reunited Hannah Gosser with Anne through the fence at Bergen-Belsen? It's not entirely clear how she died. According to a witness named Anna-Laura Beam Daniel, who was also a prisoner in Bergen-Belsen, survived the war, but like Anne and Margot, had contracted typhus and had died right next to her on a train meant to deliver them from captivity and save their lives. But another account of her death from Rachel van Ammehorn said that the Germans threw the 42-year-old woman under a train and killed her on a transport to a camp in Theresienstadt. The dentist Fritz Pfeffer was sent to Neuengamme concentration camp in northern Germany. In the camp records, his cause of death is listed as enterocolitis, which is a catch-all term that covers, among other things, dysentery and cholera, which were both common causes of death in the camps. Anne's mother Edith died on January the 6th of 1945 from starvation, 10 days before her 45th birthday and 21 days before the camp was to be liberated. Even though she had reportedly seen her daughters taken to the trains to Bergen-Belsen, she is said to have often searched for them and even insisted on saving scraps of food for them. Bergen-Belsen was liberated by the Soviets in April of 1945, just around 2 months after Margot and Anne died. After the war, Otto Frank received an anonymous letter naming Arnold Vandenberg as the man who betrayed his family and revealed their hiding place to the Nazis. Vandenberg had been a Dutch notary and part of the local Jewish council, which were administrative bodies established by the Nazis to govern Jewish communities in German-occupied Europe. And Vandenberg is said to have had access to lists of addresses where Jews were known to be in hiding. Those who served on Jewish councils were coerced into doing so with threats of violence against their families. Now, the Jewish Council of Amsterdam had no list of hiding Jews, and the Franks were very secretive about their plans to go into hiding, so Vandenberg may not have been the culprit. A professor at the University of Amsterdam noted that Vandenberg was in hiding himself around the time of the Franks' arrest on August 4th of 1944, so it's likely that he didn't have anything to do with it. Otto Frank never publicly named Vandenberg as his betrayer either, but he did tell a Dutch newspaper in 1960 that he was betrayed by someone within the Jewish community. There are a lot of theories surrounding the Frank family's betrayal. One involves William Van Maren, who worked in the Opekta warehouse where the Franks were in hiding. Another is Nelly Voskuil, a Nazi sympathizer and the sister of secret annex helper Bet Voskuil. Nelly had a relationship with a German officer and moved to Austria in the middle of the war to be with him. But the relationship ultimately fell apart and Nellie had to move back home. She's said to have returned after the Franks' arrest. If Bep Voskuil ever accidentally let anything slip about the Franks' hiding place in front of her sister, then Nellie would, without a doubt, be a prime suspect. Another well-known suspect is Ons Van Dyke, who was executed in 1948 after admitting to collaborating in the capture of 145 people, including her own brother and his family. She's said to have been responsible for as many as 700 deaths during the war. Van Dyke herself was Jewish, and she was arrested by the Nazi intelligence service in 1943. As the story goes, she exchanged her services as a covert agent in exchange for her freedom, and according to a relative of someone who was in the Dutch resistance at the time, Van Dyke was working in offices that had been commandeered by the Nazis, and she was overheard talking about the canal area where the Frank family was hiding. Van Dyke is said to have done covert operations in disguise, but as many lives as she destroyed, there doesn't seem to be any overwhelming evidence that would seem to directly implicate her in the Franks' arrest. Another possibility involves the incident with the burglars at the annex in April of 1944. Otto, along with Herman and Peter, went downstairs with a hammer to confront burglars who had forced their way in by ripping a panel out of the door facing the street. Herman even reportedly hit the ground with an axe to scare them away. When a passerby outside used a flashlight to see what was going on inside, Otto and the Van Pels boys ran back to their hiding places in a mad dash. Either the person holding the flashlight was a police officer, or someone called the police because soon afterward, the Franks heard footsteps coming up the stairway, and the bookshelf concealing the entrance to the secret annex began to shake. Now, the burglars could have reported seeing someone, or the passerby with the flashlight could have done the same, but the Franks' arrest wouldn't occur for another 4 months, so those possibilities might not be likely. Needless to say, the Franks got no rest that night. The Franks' efforts to ward off the burglars might seem foolish for someone in their position, but the warehouse was their lifeblood. Without income, they couldn't pay for the supplies or the food that they needed while they were in hiding. The year before, burglars managed to take 2 cash boxes containing 40 guilders, worth over $350 today, and coupons for 330 pounds of sugar, which may as well have been priceless at the time during war rationing. But I digress. Another possible cause for the Franks' arrest might simply be that the SS found the hiding place by chance while searching the warehouse for ration coupon fraud, which was understandably not uncommon in an economy of scarce resources. We may never know what led to the Nazis' discovery of the secret annex and the eventual deaths of most of its occupants in prison camps. You've heard the morbid numbers before. Some 50,000 dead at Bergen-Belsen, over 1 million killed at Auschwitz, some 6 million Jews killed in the war. If the Allied forces knew, why didn't they bomb the railways leading into the facilities? And why wasn't there a rallying cry from everyday people across the world to do so, especially from American civilians who were invested in supporting the war effort and who were largely separated from the immediate effects of the war? Well, in the 1940s, the American public was aware of the German death camps, but the scale of the genocide and the horrific conditions in which prisoners had to live and die wasn't a priority in the American news. Ask an average American today if the U.S. has mega prisons for foreign nationals, and they'll likely answer yes. But if you ask them where they are, you'll likely not hear much beyond Alligator Alcatraz. And if you ask how big those places are, you might be met with a shrug. But rest assured, you might find yourself surprised at just how big some of them have gotten to be. The American contracted Seacot prison in El Salvador has a capacity of 40,000 prisoners. There are a lot of conspiracy theories that name this place as a death camp. And since the president of El Salvador has boasted that no one leaves there alive, I'm inclined to take him at his word. Earlier this year, people began circulating images from Apple Maps that showed an alarmingly large red spot spread out across the cement outside the facility. And I can't say with any amount of certainty what that is. But the return of detainee Jose Abrego Garcia to the United States suggests that at least high-profile detainees may be kept alive there. But even if the United States isn't using an offshore facility for the purposes of genocide, it's most likely using it for the purpose of ethnic cleansing. And this isn't the only detention center to be aware of. The confusingly named East Montana Prison in El Paso, Texas, was built for a capacity of 5,000. The Washington Post has reported over 60 human rights violations ranging from inadequate health care to food, and the facility has cost taxpayers over $1.2 billion. This newly built mega prison is housed at Fort Bliss, which was previously a Japanese internment camp during World War II. Alligator Alcatraz is largely believed by many to be closed because of poorly worded news reports about a legal dispute with the EPA. But in truth, it's open for business. The Florida mega prison has a projected capacity of 5,000 migrants, and as you probably know, it gets its name for its remote location in the Florida Everglades, with the presence of alligators used as a deterrent to escape. The Aurora, Colorado Detention Center, privately owned by Geo Group, can hold over 1,500 people. The Queens Detention Facility in New York currently holds 200 and is projected to hold over 1,000 once completed. The Northwest Ice Processing Center in Tacoma, Washington holds 1,500. Central Florence Correctional Center in Colorado holds 1,300. Terminal Island in San Pedro, California can hold 892, and it's currently above capacity by 100 people. Imperial County Detention Center in El Centro, California was built in 1945 to incarcerate unauthorized Mexican men, and is currently being used by ICE today to hold migrants. It has a capacity of 562. Buffalo Federal Detention Facility in Batavia, New York holds 650. Port Isabel Detention Center in Los Fresnos, Texas detains adult migrants, primarily fathers and mothers who have been separated from their children, and has a capacity of 1,175 detainees. The Aguadilla Detention Facility in Puerto Rico, which was closed in 2012 for its poor and inhumane conditions, has been reopened to imprison migrants. Its current capacity is 65. Otay Mesa Detention Facility in San Diego has a capacity of 1,358. Elizabeth Contract Detention Facility in New Jersey holds 300. South Texas Family Residential Center in Texas can hold up to 2,400 migrants, and this facility was recently reopened. South Texas Ice Processing Center has a capacity of 1,814. Karnes County Detention Center in Texas has a capacity of 530. Houston Contract has a capacity of 958. Montgomery Ice Processing Center in Texas has a capacity of 1,080. IAH Polk Audit in Texas has a capacity of 913. Joe Corley Processing Center in Texas has a capacity of 1,025. Bluebonnet in Texas has a capacity of 114. At Broadview Detention Center in Illinois, nearly 5,200 people have been held between January and July of this year. And on the list goes. I know that there are those who would say, hey, if you don't want to be put in a detention center, then, don't enter the country illegally. But bear in mind, you don't have to be an illegal alien to be picked up by ICE. You might be somebody that they simply suspect. Maybe you can't tell them the hospital you were born in, or you don't have the right form of ID. And even if you do, these are people who cover their faces with masks and don't identify themselves to the public. ICE has detained somewhere around 60,000 people this year alone. They don't recognize sanctuary city laws, and they abduct people from schools, churches, and community spaces that were previously deemed off limits. Why? How about the incentives of a $50,000 signing bonus and a hefty student loan forgiveness? The Nazis had their hired thugs, and America has their own as well now. They're using tear gas and pulling guns on unarmed civilians. We've got stories of school kids hiding in stairwells just because they heard helicopters outside. And grassroots organized neighborhood watches are escorting kids to and from school just to make sure they don't disappear, as so many have. Whether or not I've convinced you to check out the graphic novelization of Anne Frank's diary, I hope you'll at least check out some books written by immigrants to the United States. There's Into the Beautiful North by Luis Alberto Urrea, or The Circuit by Francisco Jimenez, maybe The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde by Junot Diaz. These books are the author's completed visions. Anne Frank never got to finish her diary, but even as an incomplete work, it's amazing. There are those who have accused it of being a fake. They say the voice is too mature. So they accused Otto Frank of having written it himself. But the paper and handwriting were all verified back in the 1960s. Anne Frank was just that good. And somewhere somebody is writing the next amazing book that will define a chapter in human history. No matter what your personal politics are, please do anything you can to make sure that that book is finished. As always, thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join me next time.